All right, guys, we're going to be reading The Monkey's Paw together, kind of, today. Um, I'm going to put it up on the screen right here. It's going to play. I'm playing it a little bit faster. I'm going to play it at 1.5 speed. If you follow along on the Monkey's Paw doc, you'll be able to follow along right with it. I'm going to be either, I guess, recording a commentary track over it, talking about different aspects of it. So hopefully we will go on this journey together, and you'll be able to answer all the questions after. So without further ado, here's The Monkey's Paw by W.W. Jacobs.
The Monkey's Paw by W.W. Jacobs. Narrated by Peter Bishop. 1. Without, the night was cold and wet, but in the small parlour of Laburnum Villa, the blinds were drawn and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess. The former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical changes, putting his king in such sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady knitting placidly by the fire.
"Hark at that wind,"
said Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it.
They're playing chess. Chess is a game of strategy and of deep thinking. You really have to know what you're doing when you play chess. You have to plan moves and moves ahead. And it really takes a concentration while you're playing so you don't get beat. And here we see that Mr. White, the father, had seen a fatal mistake after it was too late. Now he's not thinking too carefully or too critically about what he's doing. And as we see later, this is all characterization. It's building of the character, and it kind of foreshadows what he's going to do later.
Listening.
Said the latter, grimly surveying the board as he stretched out his hand.
Check. I should hardly think he'd come tonight,
Said his father, with his hand poised over the board.
mate.
Replied the son.
That's the worst of living so far out.
Bawled Mr. White, with sudden and unlooked-for violence.
Of all the beastly, slushy, out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. Pathways a bog and the roads a torrent. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose because only 2 houses in the road are let, they think it doesn't matter.
Never mind, dear.
Said his wife soothingly.
Perhaps you'll win the next one.
Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to intercept a knowing glance between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he hid a guilty grin in his thin grey beard.
There he is,
Said Herbert White, as the gate banged to loudly and heavy footsteps came toward the door. The old man rose with hospitable...
All right, so this was written in 1903. You got around either on horse or carriage or walking, which means your range was pretty limited, right? There also wasn't a lot of TV going around. You either sat around and talked, read, like Miss White, she's knitting, you had a hobby, you played board games, or you listened to the radio, although it still wasn't as widespread as it would come to be in a few years. So one of the ways that you passed time was you had visitors come over and talk, and it was better if those visitors were from faraway lands where they can tell stories of places you've never heard before. And so this was like an evening's entertainment. You would usually feed your guest, offer them something to drink, and this is kind of what's going on here.
haste, and, opening the door, was heard condoling with the new arrival. The new arrival also condoled with himself, so that Mrs. White said,
"Tut tut,"
and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady of eye and rubicund of visage.
Sergeant Major Morris.
Rubicund, red of face, okay? It means he's red-faced. It's cold outside. When you're exposed to cold, it can turn your face red. This is Sergeant Major Morris. He has been in the Army for 20 years, probably Army or Navy. British, they were big, they had a lot of colonies back then, and the phrase was the sun never sets on the British Empire. I'm sure you've learned that within your world history, and this was a time when they held sway over most of the world, and the way that they did that was through a strong army and navy. So this guy, Sergeant Major Morris, has been to India. They called it the Far East, and he's going to regale them with tales of his travels. One of the first things they're going to do, though, is offer him something to drink. He's cold. He talks about, I think it talks about some whiskey, and tumbler stood in a a small copper kettle on the fire. So what they do is they heat up the whiskey, they add other ingredients, they call it a hot toddy, and it's supposed to warm you up from the inside out and make you more comfortable after a long uh, journey in the cold. Very British.
He said, introducing him. The sergeant major shook hands, and taking the proffered seat by the fire, watched contentedly while his host got out whiskey and tumblers and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. At the third glass, his eyes got brighter, and he began to talk.
Third glass. He's had 3 hot toddies already. Loosened his tongue a little bit.
The little family circled, regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts, as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of the wild scenes and doughty deeds, of wars and plagues and strange peoples.
21 years of it,
said Mr. White, nodding
That's a
at his
full
brief son.
career.
When he went away, he was a slip of a youth in the warehouse. Now look at him.
He don't look to have taken much harm.
Said Mrs. White, politely.
I'd like to go to India myself.
Said the old man.
Just to look around a bit, you know.
Better where you are.
Said the sergeant major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass, and sighing softly, shook it again.
I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers.
Said the old man.
What was that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris?
So, old fakirs and jugglers and temples, basically religion and religious people, although most of it seemed to be magic of some sort to the British people whose religion and rituals and customs were much different than people in India.
Nothing.
Said the soldier hastily.
Leastways, nothing worth hearing.
Monkey's paw?
It's the first time
Mrs. White,
the
curiously.
soldier says you don't want to hear
Well,
it.
it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps.
Said the sergeant major, offhandedly. His 3 listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips, and then set it down again. His host filled it for him.
To look at it,
Said the sergeant major, fumbling in his pocket.
it's just an ordinary little paw dried to a mummy.
He took something out of his pocket and proffered it. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. "And what is there special about it?" inquired Mr. White, as he took it from his son, and having examined it, placed it upon the table.
It had a spell put on it by an old fakir.
Magic man, religious guy, that's a fakir.
Said the sergeant major.
A very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow.
There it is, right there. If you want to take a theme out of this story, it is right there. Okay? He put a spell on it to show that fate ruled people's lives, that those who interfered with it did so at their sorrow. He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it.
He put a spell on it so that 3 separate men could each have 3
There it
wishes
is.
from it.
His manner was so impressive that his hearers were conscious that their light laughter jarred somewhat.
Well, why don't you have 3, sir?
Said Herbert White, cleverly. The soldier regarded him in the way that middle age is wont to regard presumptuous youth.
I have.
He said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened.
So, he's had his 3 wishes. Does he seem happy about his 3 wishes? If these wishes were the awesomest thing in the world, like Herbert, the son, is trying to make out, wouldn't he be excited and giddy and telling them about it? Think about that.
And did you really have the 3 wishes granted?
Asked Mrs. White.
I did.
Said the sergeant major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth.
His glass tapped against his teeth because his hands were shaking.
And has anybody else wished?
Persisted the old lady.
The first man had his 3 wishes, yes.
Notice they don't ask him what his wishes were.
Was the reply.
I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw.
Wow. Must be awesome if your 3rd wish was for death, right? Think about those. These are all red lights. And nobody is seeming to get it. And yes, it may seem like some far out thing, but 3 wishes and the last was for death. And when Sergeant Major Morris talks about his wishes, he's like not, very excited about any of it. So, signs that the family is ignoring.
His tones were so grave that a hush fell upon the group.
If you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris.
Said the old man at last.
What'd you keep it for?
The soldier shook his head.
Fancy, I suppose.
He said slowly.
I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It has caused enough mischief already. Besides, people won't buy. They think it's a fairy tale, some of them. And those who do think anything of it want to try it first and pay me afterward.
If you could have another 3 wishes,
Said the old man, eyeing him keenly.
would you have them?
I don't know,
said the other.
I don't know.
Doesn't sound very confident, does he? He sounds kind of scared.
He took the paw and, dangling it between his forefinger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a sudden cry, stooped down and snatched it off,
Better let it burn.
said the soldier.
That's
solemnly.
like the fourth or fifth warning.
If you don't want it, Morris,
said the other.
give it to me.
I won't.
Said his
Okay,
friend.
he doesn't want to give it to him.
I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire again like a sensible man.
The other shook his head and examined his new possession closely.
How do you do it?
He inquired,
Hold it up in your right hand and wish aloud.
said the sergeant major.
But I warn you of the consequences.
That's like warning number 5. Okay? Red flags, warnings, they don't seem to be very keen on taking them, do they?
Sounds like the Arabian Nights.
Said Mr.
Arabian
White.
Nights is a bunch of stories that are fairy tales that aren't really true, but they're meant to sound true, and so that's what she's saying. It doesn't sound like this could actually
She rose
happen.
and began to set the supper.
Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me?
Her husband drew the talisman from pocket, and then all three burst into laughter as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm.
They think it's a joke. Obviously, the sergeant major doesn't, and yet they're still not heeding any of his warnings.
If you must wish,
He said gruffly.
wish for something sensible.
Mr. White dropped it back in his pocket, and placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table. In the business of supper, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward the three sat listening in an enthralled fashion to a second installment of the soldier's adventures in India.
If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he has been telling us,
Said Herbert, as the door closed behind their guest, just in time for him to catch the last train.
we shan't make much out of it.
Did you give him anything for it, Father?
Inquired Mrs. White, regarding her husband closely.
A trifle.
He said, colouring slightly.
He didn't want it, but I made him take it. And he pressed me again to throw it away.
Likely.
Said Herbert with pretend horror.
Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be an emperor, father, to begin with. Then you can't be henpecked.
He darted round the table, pursued by the maligned Mrs. White, armed with an antimacassar.
You don't need to know what an antimacassar is.
Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously.
I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact.
He said slowly.
It seems to me I've got all I want.
If you only cleared that house, you'd be quite
Okay, I'll tell you what an antimacassar is. An antimacassar is one of the doilies or coverings that you put over an armrest. That's all. She's just swiping at him with it.
happy, wouldn't you?
Said Herbert, with his hand on his shoulder.
Well, wish for £200 then. That'll just do it.
We're talking about clearing the house.
His father,
That means
smiling
paying off
shamefacedly at his own
the house so
credulity,
they
held
own.
up the talisman, and his son, with a solemn face somewhat marred by a wink at his mother, sat down at the piano and struck a few impressive chords.
I wish for £200.
Said the old man distinctly.
He's ignored several warnings, and he finally says, "Yep, you know what? That's fine. I'll wish for £200 so I can pay off my house, and we won't have to worry about that anymore." The son is kind of making a joke out of it and playing on the piano.
A fine crash from the piano greeted the words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran toward him.
It moved.
He cried, with a glance of disgust at the object as it lay on the floor.
As I wished, it twisted in my hand like a snake.
Well, I don't see the money.
Said his son as he picked it up and placed it on the table.
And I bet I never shall.
It must have been your fancy, Father.
Said his wife, regarding him anxiously.
You're just making things up.
He shook his head.
Never mind, though, there's no harm done. It gave me a shock all the same.
They sat down by the fire again while the two men finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, and the old man started nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs.
The moving paw has got him a
Silence and
little
oppressive
freaked
settled
out.
upon all three, which lasted until the old couple rose to retire for the night.
I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed.
Said Herbert as he bade them good night.
And something horrible squatting up on top of the wardrobe, watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains.
Okay, I forgot to mention pounds. Pounds is British money. A pound is like $1 for them. They call it pound sterling. It was often regarded with. It was based on silver. So a pound silver sterling is what their like dollar was based on, and then it broke down into shillings and pence, and it was really really complicated. And since they've gone to the same thing, like 16 shillings was a pence, and so many pence, like 8 pence was a pound. It was crazy. Now it's still pence and pennies and pounds sterling. They also call them quid. I have no idea why, but it's British money. Just thought that's all you got to think. He's waiting for British money.
He sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire and seeing faces in it. The last face was so horrible and so simian that he gazed at it in amazement. It got so vivid that, with a little uneasy laugh, he felt on the table for a glass containing a little water to throw over it. His hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver, he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed. 2. In the brightness of the wintry sun next morning as it streamed over the breakfast table, he laughed
All right, next day. We've had a little bit of a break. Here it comes.
at his fears. There was an air of prosaic wholesomeness about the room which it had lacked on the previous night, and the dirty, shriveled little paw was pitched on the sidewalk with a carelessness which betokened no great belief in its virtues.
I suppose all old soldiers are the same.
Said Mrs. White.
The idea of our listening to such nonsense. How could wishes be granted in these days? And if they could, how could £200 hurt you, Father?
Might drop on his head from the sky?
Said a frivolous Herbert.
Morris said that things happen so naturally.
Okay, so what did Herbert say might drop on his head from the sky? Think about 200 coins dropping from your head on the sky at once. So, the night, think about times a day. The night is when the scary thing happens that, you're more susceptible to believing things at night. Now that the day has come, they kind of feel it's silly. And so, he said, Morris said things happen so naturally that you might, if you so wished, attribute it to coincidence. Let's keep that in mind.
Said his father.
That you might, if you so wished, attribute it to coincidence.
Well, don't break into the money before I come back.
Said Herbert as he rose from the table.
I'm afraid it'll turn you into a mean, avaricious man, and we shall have to disown you.
His mother laughed, and following him to the door, watched him down the road, and returning to the breakfast table, was very happy at the expense of her husband's credulity. All of which did not prevent her from scurrying to the door at the postman's knock, nor prevent her from referring somewhat shortly to retired sergeant majors of bibulous habits when she found that the post had brought a tailor's bill.
Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home.
She said as they sat at dinner.
I dare say.
Said Mr. White, pouring himself out some beer.
But for all that, the thing moved in my hand. That I'll swear to.
You thought it did.
Said the old lady soothingly.
I say it did.
Replied the other.
There was no thought about it. It had just... What's the matter?
His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside, who, peering in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. In mental connection with the £200, she noticed that the stranger was well dressed and wore a silk hat of glossy newness. 3 times he paused at the gate, and then walked on again. A 4th time, he stood with his hand upon it, and then, with a sudden resolution, flung it open and walked up the path. Mrs. White, at the same moment, placed her hands behind her, and hurriedly unfastening the strings of her apron, put that useful article of apparel beneath the cushion of her chair. She brought the stranger, who seemed ill at ease, into the room. He gazed at her furtively, and listened in a preoccupied fashion as the
Does this man look like he has to deliver good news? Not really. He's very nervous.
old lady apologized for the appearance of the room and her husband's coat, a garment which he usually reserved for the garden. She then waited as patiently as her sex would permit for him to broach his business, but he was at first strangely silent.
I was asked to call.
He said at last, and stooped and picked a piece of cotton from his trousers.
I come from Ma and Megan's.
The old lady started.
That's where the sun works. Ma and Megan's.
Is anything the matter?
She asked breathlessly.
Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it?
Her husband interposed.
Hello, Mother.
He said hastily,
Sit down and don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir.
and he eyed the other wistfully.
I'm sorry.
Began the visitor.
Is he hurt?
Demanded the mother wildly. The visitor bowed in assent.
Badly hurt.
He said quietly.
But he is not in any pain.
Oh, thank God. God.
Said the old woman, clasping her hands.
Thank God for that thing.
She broke off suddenly as the sinister meaning of the assurance dawned upon her, and she saw the awful confirmation of her fears in the other's averted face.
So, yeah, he's hurt really bad, but he's not in pain. 'Cause he's dead. Okay? Son died.
She caught her breath, and turning to her slower-witted husband, laid her trembling old hand upon his. There was a long silence.
He was caught in the machinery.
Very industrious during this time period. This is during the Industrial Revolution, right? So there's a lot of machines going on. There are people working on it. And getting caught in a machine basically means you're mangled. And so this is what happened to their son.
Said the visitor at length in a low voice.
Caught in the machinery.
Repeated Mr. White in a dazed fashion.
Yes.
He sat staring blankly out at the window, and taking his wife's hand between his own, pressed it as he had been wont to do in their old courting days nearly 40 years before.
He was the only one left to us.
He said, turning gently to the visitor.
It is hard.
The other coughed and, rising, walked slowly to the window.
The firm wished me to convey their sincere sympathy with you in your great loss.
He said, without looking round.
I beg that you will understand that I am only their servant and merely obeying orders.
There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring, and her breath inaudible. On the husband's face was a look such as his friend the sergeant might have carried into his first action.
I was to say that Ma and Meggins disclaim all responsibility.
Continued the other.
They admit no liability at all, but in consideration of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum as compensation.
Mr. White.
How much are they going to offer them? I can give you a hint. You already know.
Dropped his wife's hand, and rising to his feet, gazed with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words.
How much?
£200,
was the answer. Unconscious of his wife's shriek, the old man smiled faintly, put out his hands like a sightless man, and dropped, a senseless heap, to the floor. 3. In the huge new cemetery, some 2 miles distant, the old people buried their dead and came back to a house steeped in shadow and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it, and remained in a state of expectation as though of something else to happen. Something else which was to lighten this load, too heavy for old hearts to bear. But the days passed, and expectations gave place to resignation. The hopeless resignation of the old, sometimes miscalled apathy. Sometimes they hardly exchanged a word, for now they had nothing to talk about, and their days were long to weariness. It was about a week after that the old man, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was in darkness, and the sound of subdued weeping came from the window. He raised himself in bed and listened.
Come back.
He said tenderly.
You will be cold.
It is colder for my son,
Said the old woman, and wept afresh. The sound of her sobs died away on his ears. The bed was warm, and his eyes heavy with sleep. He dozed fitfully, and then slept until a sudden wild cry from his wife awoke him with a start.
The paw!
She cried wildly.
The monkey's paw!
He started up in alarm.
Where is it? What's the matter?
She came stumbling
What's her bright idea?
across the room toward him.
I want it.
She said quietly.
You've not destroyed it.
It's in the parlour, on the bracket.
He replied, marveling.
Why?
She cried and laughed together, and bending over, kissed his cheek.
I only just thought of it.
She said hysterically.
Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it?
Think of what? He questioned.
The other 2 wishes.
She replied rapidly.
We've only had one.
Was that not enough?
He demanded fiercely.
No!
She cried triumphantly.
We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly and wish our boy alive again.
The man
So their first wish killed the son. What do you think's going to happen when they wish it again?
sat up in bed and flung the bedclothes from his quaking limbs.
Good God, you are mad.
He cried, aghast.
Get it.
She panted.
Get it quickly and wish... Oh, my boy, my boy.
Her husband struck a match and lit the candle.
Get back to bed.
He said unsteadily.
You don't know what you're saying.
We had the first wish granted.
Said the old woman feverishly.
Why not the second?
Coincidence.
Stammered the old man.
Go and get it and wish.
Cried his wife, quivering with excitement. The old man turned and regarded her, and his voice shook.
He has been dead 10 days, and besides I would not tell you else, but I could only recognize him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see then, how now?
Bring him back.
Cried the old woman, and dragged him toward the door.
Do you think I fear the child I have nursed?
He went down in the darkness and felt his way to the parlour, and then to the mantelpiece. The talisman was in its place, and a horrible fear that the unspoken wish might bring his mutilated son before him ere he could escape from the room seized upon him, and he caught his breath as he found that he had lost the direction of the door. His brow cold with sweat, he felt his way round the table and groping along the wall until he found himself in a small passage with the unwholesome thing in his hand.
Dang it.
Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered the room. It was white and expectant, and to his fears seemed to have an unnatural look upon it. He was afraid of her.
Wish!
She cried in a strong voice.
It is foolish and wicked.
He faltered.
Wish!
Repeated his wife. He raised his hand.
I wish my son alive again.
The talisman fell to the floor, and he regarded it fearfully. Then he sank trembling into a chair as the old woman, with burning eyes, walked to the window and raised the blind. He sat until he was chilled with the cold, glancing occasionally at the figure of the old woman peering through the window. The candle end, which had burned below the rim of the china candlestick, was throwing pulsating shadows on the ceiling and walls, until, with a flicker larger than the rest, it expired. The old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, crept back to his bed, and a minute or two afterward the old woman came silently and apathetically beside him. Neither spoke, but lay silently listening to the ticking of the clock. A stair creaked, and a squeaky mouse scurried noisily through the wall. The darkness was oppressive, and after lying for some time screwing up his courage, he took the box of matches and, striking one, went downstairs for a candle. At the foot of the stairs the match went out, and he paused to strike another, and at the same moment a knock, so quiet and stealthy as to be scarcely audible, sounded on the front door. The matches fell from his hand and spilled in the passage. He stood motionless, his breath suspended until the knock was repeated. Then he turned and fled swiftly back to his room, and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded through the house.
What's that?
Cried the old woman, starting up.
A rat.
Said the old man in shaking tones.
A rat. It passed me on the stairs.
His wife sat up in bed listening. A loud knock resounded through the house.
It's Herbert! It's Herbert!
She ran to the door, but her husband was before her, and catching her by her arm, held her tightly.
What are you going to do?
He whispered hoarsely.
It's my boy! It's Herbert!
She cried, struggling mechanically.
I forgot it was 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let go, I must open the door.
For God's sake, don't let it in!
Cried the old man.
Alright, so the wife thinks it's the son, and the father knows, yeah, it might be the son, but not really anymore, right?
Trembling.
You're afraid of your own son!
She cried, struggling.
Let me go! I'm coming, Herbert, I'm coming!
There was another knock, and another. The old woman, with a sudden wrench, broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed to the landing, and called after her appealingly as she hurried downstairs. He heard the chain rattle back and the bottom bolt drawn slowly and stiffly from the socket. Then the old woman's voice, strained and panting.
The bolt!
She cried loudly.
Come down, I can't reach it!
But her husband was on his hands and knees, groping wildly on the floor in search of the paw. If he could only find it before the thing outside got in. A perfect fusillade of knocks reverberated through the house, and he heard the scraping of a chair as his wife put it down in the passage against the door. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and at the same moment, he found the monkey's paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking ceased suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair drawn back, and the door opened. A cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a long, loud wail of disappointment and misery from his wife gave him the courage to run down to her side, and then to the gate beyond.
Alright, so, what was the third wish? Does it ever tell you what the third wish is? No, because we know what the third wish is, right? They do a great job of building the suspense throughout this whole thing. You kind of know something's going to go wrong, you don't really know what's going to go wrong. You kind of know what's going to happen, you don't really know. And there's a lot of ways that he kind of goes about hinting at things, which is very good. So the last 2 paragraphs are really good. But her husband, on his hands and knees, groping wildly on the floor in search of the paw, if he can only find it before the thing outside got in. A perfect fusillade of knocks that's really heavy reverberated through the house, and he heard the scraping of a chair as his wife put down the passage against the door. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and at the same moment he found the monkey's paw. So the tension of, is his wife going to get the door open before he finds this paw type of thing? What's outside? Is it going to get her? And frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking ceased suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair drawn back and the door opened. A cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a long, loud wail of disappointment and misery from his wife gave him the courage to run down to her side, and then to the gate beyond. The street lamp flickering opposite shone on a quiet and deserted road. Okay, like I said, great tension, great foreshadowing in the beginning about really not thinking of the consequences of your actions, and great outcome in the end too, because nobody knows what was outside, but you have an idea. It's one of those things where they don't have to draw you a picture or paint the picture for you. You paint one in your imagination on your own, and it's totally better than anything some special effects crew can put up. That's it for the monkey's paw. Make sure you get those questions done. If you have any questions, I will be online. You can go ahead and ask. Other than that, be safe, be well, have a good day.